Three gunmen step out of a black sedan. 9 shots ring out. One of the most feared men in Oakland's underworld lies face down on his own driveway, blood pooling beneath him. Thomas Blade Mitchell had enemies, lots of them. But who finally pulled the trigger? And why did one of California's most powerful gang leaders have to die? The story of Blade Mitchell isn't just another gang tale. It's about power, prison codes, and how one man changed the rules of the game until the game changed him. You think you know how gang stories end? This one has twists nobody saw coming. In the working-class neighborhoods of East Oakland, kids don't grow up dreaming about joining gangs. They dream about getting out. But sometimes life doesn't give you many options. For Thomas Mitchell, the path seemed already marked out. His neighborhood wasn't just poor, it was forgotten. Schools barely functioned, jobs were scarce, and the police were seen as an occupying force, not protectors. As a teenager in the late 1990s, Thomas was quiet but smart. Teachers said he had potential. But potential doesn't pay bills or keep you safe when rival neighborhood crews see you as an enemy just because of your address. By 16, Thomas had already witnessed 3 shootings. By 17, he'd lost 2 friends to gang violence. The thing about growing up in those neighborhoods, explains former Oakland police detective James Cortez, who spent years investigating gang activity, is that staying neutral isn't really an option. At some point, kids get forced to choose sides, whether they want to or not. For Thomas, that choice came after a beating that left him hospitalized. Walking home from school, he was jumped by members of a rival neighborhood crew. They didn't just hurt him, they humiliated him. 6 against 1, they took turns punching and kicking while others recorded on flip phones. The video spread through school the next day. Thomas never returned to class after that. Instead, he found protection with a small local gang called the East Side Cobras. At first, they just offered security, strength in numbers. But soon, Thomas was running errands, then holding product, then making sales. The quiet kid with potential was being pulled deeper into a life that would eventually consume him. What people don't understand, says community activist Darnell Washington, who grew up in the same area, is that for many of these young men, gangs provide what society doesn't: protection, income, respect, and a sense of family. It's not right, but when you've got nothing else, those things mean everything. Thomas might have remained a low-level member, maybe eventually aging out of the life, finding legitimate work, starting a family, the exit path that some managed to take. But fate had other plans. At 19, he was arrested for possession with intent to distribute. With California's tough sentencing laws, he was looking at serious time. It was behind the cold concrete walls of San Quentin State Prison that Thomas Mitchell truly found his calling, and where the quiet teenager became the man who would later be known as Blade. California's prison system in the early 2000s was overcrowded, underfunded, and largely controlled by prison gangs. New inmates quickly learned that survival meant aligning with one of the major groups based on race, neighborhood, or other affiliations. The prison yard operated by codes and rules, invisible to guards, but crystal clear to those who lived there. For Thomas, prison should have been just another stop in a predictable story. Young man goes in for drugs, comes out more hardened, returns to the same life, and eventually ends up dead or back in prison. It's a cycle as old as prisons themselves. But something different happened to Thomas. He wasn't just any inmate. People noticed him. His intelligence, his calmness under pressure, his ability to plan ahead while others reacted emotionally. These weren't just useful skills in prison. They were rare qualities that made him valuable. Thomas was quickly recruited by one of the three major prison gangs known collectively as the Numbers. These were the 25S, 26S, and 36S, each with their own hierarchies, rules, and specialized roles within prison society. Thomas joined the 25S, known as the Intelligence Branch, focused on gathering information, managing communications, and planning operations. Prison gangs aren't just about protection, explains former prison counselor Maria Diaz. They're complex organizations with their own economies, politics, and cultures. The Numbers gangs in particular have a whole mythology and code system dating back decades. At first, Thomas was just another soldier learning the rules, but his rise through the ranks was meteoric. Where others used brute force, Thomas used strategy. Where others saw only enemies, he saw potential alliances. When violence erupted between rival factions, it was often Thomas who negotiated the peace, not out of compassion, but because constant warfare was bad for business. Within 2 years, he had earned his nickname Blade, not because he used knives, but because, as one former inmate explained, he cut through problems clean and quick. Prison officials noted his growing influence, placing him under increased surveillance, but they could never catch him directly involved in prohibited activities. Blade was too smart, too careful. By the time he was released in 2008, after serving 5 years, Thomas Blade Mitchell was no longer just a member of the 25S. He was a ranking officer with connections throughout the California prison system. More importantly, he had a vision that would transform not just his future, but the nature of gang operations in Oakland. Most gang members leaving prison return to the same patterns that got them locked up in the first place. They go back to the same neighborhoods, hang with the same crowds, and engage in the same activities. The cycle continues because they don't see alternatives. Blade saw alternatives everywhere. The East Side Cobras he had joined as a teenager were still around, but they were small-time, corner dealers fighting over scraps of territory, engaging in petty beefs that brought heat from police without generating real money. Blade surveyed this landscape with new eyes. He had seen how the prison gangs operated, with structure, discipline, and clearly defined roles. He had learned that violence wasn't a goal, but a tool, to be used precisely and sparingly. When Blade returned to Oakland, he brought these lessons with him. The first thing he did was reconnect with his old Cobra associates, but not to rejoin them as they were. He had bigger plans. "What are we doing here?" he reportedly asked at a meeting in the back room of a car wash owned by a Cobra member. Fighting over corners, shooting each other over disrespect. Meanwhile, the real money is passing right through our hands to people who wouldn't even drive through our neighborhoods. Blade proposed a complete reorganization. The Cobras would adopt a structure similar to what he had seen in prison, with departments handling different aspects of operations. They would minimize violence not out of mercy, but because violence attracted police attention. They would focus not just on drug sales, but on expanding into protection rackets, loan sharking, and even semi-legitimate businesses that could launder money. Most radically, Blade proposed alliances with former rivals. "Every time we fight each other," he told his skeptical audience, "the police win. Every time we shoot each other, we lose soldiers, territory, and money. It's bad business. Not everyone bought in. Some older members saw Blade as an upstart trying to change traditions. Some younger ones thought his caution was weakness. But enough recognized the wisdom in his words that Blade was able to start implementing his vision. The transformation didn't happen overnight. But over the next 3 years, the East Side Cobras evolved from a neighborhood crew into something much more sophisticated. They began buying legitimate businesses, a car wash, a check-cashing place, eventually even an apartment building. They established relationships with corrupt officials who could provide information or look the other way at critical moments. They created a bail fund for members, ensuring that arrested soldiers wouldn't flip to avoid jail time. Most importantly, Blade established peace with 2 rival gangs, creating an informal consortium that divided territory by agreement rather than through bloodshed. This allowed all 3 groups to focus on making money rather than defending turf. What Mitchell did, says former prosecutor Karen Thompson, who later tried cases against Cobra members, was essentially bring corporate thinking to street gangs. He understood that constant conflict was cutting into profits. He saw potential partnerships where others only saw enemies. It was disturbingly innovative. By 2012, the Cobras controlled a significant portion of Oakland's drug trade, had hooks in several legitimate businesses, and had expanded their operations to include loan sharking, protection rackets, and even some gambling operations. Violence still occurred, but it was strategic rather than reactive, designed to send messages rather than settle scores. At the center of it all was Blade, who had risen from street soldier to something much closer to a CEO. He lived in a modest house in a decent neighborhood, drove a nice but not flashy car, and dressed well but not ostentatiously. Unlike many gang leaders who flaunted their wealth, Blade understood the value of staying under the radar. He wasn't out there posting on social media or showing off, says a former associate who requested anonymity. Man had like 3 pairs of jeans and 5 shirts, all nice, but nothing special. His watch probably cost $500, not $50,000. He said calling attention to yourself was for people with small minds and short futures. But even as Blade built his empire, forces were gathering that would eventually bring it all crashing down. The very success of his operation had made it a target, and the alliances he had forged, revolutionary as they were, contained the seeds of their own destruction. The Oakland Police Department wasn't blind to what was happening in their city. They saw the changing patterns of drug distribution, noted the decrease in random shootings, and the increase in targeted hits. They recognized the signatures of a more organized criminal operation. The problem was proving it. Blade had learned in prison how to insulate himself from direct criminal activity. He gave orders verbally, never in writing. He used intermediaries for sensitive communications. He conducted important business in places unlikely to be under surveillance: church basements, public parks, crowded restaurants. He regularly changed phones and limited what was said on them. He was almost impossible to build a case against, admits former Oakland PD Lieutenant Marcus Wilson. We knew he was calling shots, but proving it was another matter. Everyone we picked up either knew nothing or was too scared to talk, and he kept his hands clean. No drugs, no guns, nothing that would give us probable cause to get him directly. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While local authorities struggled to build a case against Blade, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had been quietly following the money. Drug dealers might understand street tactics, but they often underestimate the power of forensic accounting. By 2013, IRS investigators had mapped a complex web of cash flows from street-level drug sales through various businesses connected to the Cobras. They had documented suspicious cash deposits, questionable business expenses, and a pattern of tax filings that simply didn't add up. It wasn't enough to bring down the entire operation, but it was enough to indict Blade on money laundering and tax evasion charges. The arrest in September 2013 sent shockwaves through Oakland's underworld. Blade had seemed untouchable, his operation too smart to fail. Now he was facing federal charges that carried substantial prison time. More worryingly for his organization, federal prosecutors were making it clear they wanted information on the entire Cobra operation in exchange for leniency. This created the first real cracks in the empire Blade had built. With their leader facing years behind bars and federal agents sniffing around for informants, some Cobra members began to consider their options. Loyalty is a prized quality in gang culture, but self-preservation often proves stronger. The first to flip was a mid-level distributor named Dayon Jackson. Facing his own drug charges with enhanced penalties due to a prior conviction, Jackson agreed to provide information about the Cobras operation in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony alone wasn't enough to bring additional charges against Blade, but it opened doors for investigators who now had names, locations, and operational details they had previously lacked. Throughout this period, Blade maintained his composure. From jail, he continued to run the Cobras through trusted lieutenants, including his second-in-command, Eric "Smooth" Peterson. He instructed his lawyers to fight the charges aggressively, seeming confident that the government's case, based largely on financial transactions rather than direct criminal activity, could be defeated or at least minimized. However, another threat was emerging. This one from within the alliances Blade had so carefully constructed. The peace between the Cobras and their former rivals had always been a marriage of convenience rather than true brotherhood, with Blade's legal troubles creating uncertainty about the future of his organization. Ambitious figures in the other gangs began to see opportunity. Chief among them was Darius Dmac McKenzie, leader of the West Oakland Disciples, who had never fully bought into Blade's vision of cooperation. Dmac was old school. He believed in taking territory by force and sending messages through violence. He had respected Blade's power enough to maintain the alliance, but with Blade now vulnerable, Dmac began quietly testing boundaries, moving dealers into traditionally Cobra areas and poaching some of their smaller business customers. At the same time, internal dissent was growing within the Cobras themselves. Eric Peterson was loyal to Blade, but not everyone shared his devotion. Some younger members, particularly those who had risen after Blade transformed the organization, saw his legal troubles as an opportunity for advancement. They began operating with increasing independence, sometimes in direct contradiction to orders from Blade relayed through Peterson. The situation reached a critical point in early 2014 when Blade, still awaiting trial, made a fateful decision. Through his prison connections with the 25S, he arranged for the removal of Dmac, seeing the West Oakland leader's encroachment as a direct threat to everything he had built. The hit took place on a rainy Tuesday night outside a nightclub in downtown Oakland. 3 shooters approached Dmac as he walked to his car, firing multiple times before escaping in a waiting vehicle. Dmac survived but was critically wounded, spending weeks in the hospital before eventually recovering with partial paralysis. The attempted assassination of Dmac shattered the fragile peace between Oakland's gangs. The West Oakland disciples retaliated with a series of attacks on Cobra members and businesses. The third gang in the alliance, sensing opportunity in the chaos, began making moves to secure additional territory for themselves. Violence that had been strategic and contained now became widespread and indiscriminate. For Blade, watching from his jail cell, the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The organization he had built with such care was fracturing before his eyes. His lieutenant, Peterson, was struggling to maintain order as younger members increasingly ignored his authority. The police, energized by the uptick in violence, intensified their investigations into all gang activity in the city. In a final blow, federal prosecutors revealed a new witness against Blade, one from within his inner circle. Marcus Lil Smoke Johnson, once one of Blade's most trusted advisors, had been secretly cooperating with authorities for months, wearing a wire to meetings with other Cobra leaders and providing detailed information about the organization's structure and operations. With Johnson's testimony, prosecutors expanded their case against Blade, adding racketeering charges that could keep him imprisoned for decades. The evidence was damning. Recorded conversations, financial records, witness statements, all pointing to Blade as the mastermind behind a sophisticated criminal enterprise. In July 2014, recognizing the overwhelming case against him, Blade accepted a plea deal, admitting to money laundering, tax evasion, and racketeering charges in exchange for a 15-year sentence, significantly less than the 30-plus years he might have faced if convicted at trial. The plea deal marked the effective end of Thomas Blade Mitchell's reign as Oakland's most innovative gang leader. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, the most shocking chapters were yet to be written. With Blade headed to federal prison, leadership of the Cobras officially passed to Eric Peterson, but the organization Blade had built was already coming apart at the seams. The alliance with rival gangs had collapsed completely, leading to open warfare on the streets. Internal discipline had broken down, with various factions operating independently and often at cross purposes. Peterson tried to maintain Blade's vision of a business-like operation, but he lacked his mentor's strategic mind and natural authority. Increasingly, he found himself unable to control the more violent elements within the Cobras, who saw the new era as a return to old-school gang tactics, terrifying neighborhoods into submission through displays of brutal force. For the next 3 years, Oakland experienced a surge in gang violence as the carefully constructed ecosystem Blade had created devolved into chaos. The Cobras fragmented into smaller crews, each claiming to be the true heirs to Blade's legacy, while abandoning the principles that had made him successful. The police, while happy to see the sophisticated criminal network disrupted, were overwhelmed by the uptick in shootings, robberies, and drug-related crime. Meanwhile, Blade was transferred to a federal correctional facility in Colorado, far from his power base, in Oakland. Unlike his previous prison stint, where he had risen to prominence within the numbers gangs, Blade kept a low profile in federal custody. He maintained minimal contact with his former associates, instead using his time to educate himself, earning a GED and taking business courses offered through a prison education program. Those who spoke with him during this period describe a man who seemed resigned to his fate, but not defeated by it. He read extensively, business books, legal texts, even some philosophy, he exercised daily and avoided the prison politics that he had once navigated so skillfully. Some interpreted this as evidence that Blade had accepted his criminal career was over. Others believed he was simply biding his time, planning for an eventual return. What no one expected was his early release. In late 2018, after serving less than half of his 15-year sentence, Blade was suddenly freed through a combination of good behavior credits, changes to federal sentencing guidelines, and some suspected his continued cooperation with authorities on other cases. His return to Oakland in January 2019 sent ripples through the city's underworld. The Cobras, now a shadow of the organization he had built, were split into competing factions. Eric Peterson had been killed 2 years earlier in what police classified as a drug deal gone wrong, though street rumors suggested an internal power struggle. The West Oakland disciples, under new leadership since Dmac's partial paralysis had forced his retirement from street life, had expanded their territory to include former Cobra strongholds. For the first few months after his release, Blade kept his head down. He moved into a modest apartment in Fruitvale, secured a job as a manager at one of the legitimate businesses he had once used for money laundering, now under new ownership, and reportedly attended weekly meetings with his parole officer without incident. To all outward appearances, Thomas Mitchell was attempting to rebuild his life as a law-abiding citizen, but appearances can be deceiving. By summer 2019, subtle changes were occurring in Oakland's gang landscape. Former Cobra members began to reunite under a new banner. Businesses that had once paid protection to rival gangs suddenly switched allegiances. Street-level drug dealers who had operated independently started responding to coordinated direction. And all of this happened with minimal violence. Just a few strategic removals of individuals who refused to fall in line. Law enforcement was slow to connect these changes to Blade. His parole conditions included prohibitions against associating with known gang members or engaging in criminal activity, and on the surface, he appeared to be complying. He went to work, came home, occasionally visited family, and maintained regular check-ins with his parole officer. Nothing in his visible behavior suggested he was rebuilding his criminal network, but rebuild it he did, using lessons learned from both his previous success and his downfall. The new organization, never referred to as the Cobras, a name now tainted by failure, operated even more discreetly than before. Cell phones were used sparingly, with members preferring face-to-face communication in secure locations. Money moved through a complex web of digital currencies and overseas accounts, making it nearly impossible to track. Violence, when necessary, was carried out by contractors with no direct connection to the organization, creating layers of deniability. Most importantly, Blade ensured no single person besides himself had a complete understanding of the operation. Information was compartmentalized, with each member knowing only what they needed to for their specific role. This not only protected the organization from infiltration, but also secured Blade's position at its center. He alone held all the pieces of the puzzle. By early 2020, Blade had effectively re-established himself as a power in Oakland's underworld, though in a form unrecognizable to authorities, still using outdated intelligence about gang structures and territories. His operation now extended beyond traditional gang activities into more sophisticated criminal enterprises, including real estate fraud, identity theft, and even some cybercrime, facilitated by tech-savvy recruits. It might have continued this way indefinitely, with Blade operating in the shadows while maintaining a legitimate facade, had it not been for an unexpected development from his past. In March 2020, Marcus Lil Smoke Johnson, the former Cobra lieutenant whose testimony had been crucial in the case against Blade, was released from witness protection. Johnson had served a reduced sentence in an undisclosed location and was supposed to be resettled under a new identity far from California. But for reasons never fully explained, possibly including his own homesickness or carelessness, Johnson returned to Oakland. Word of his return reached Blade within days. The man whose testimony had sent him to federal prison was now walking freely in the same city, seemingly unconcerned about potential repercussions. For Blade, this represented both a threat and an insult. If Johnson could betray him and return unpunished, what message did that send to others in his organization? How could he maintain discipline if such a flagrant violation of street code went unanswered? The decision to eliminate Johnson was not made lightly. Blade understood that any connection between Johnson's inevitable death and himself would likely violate his parole and send him back to prison, possibly for decades. But he also recognized that allowing Johnson to live would undermine the very foundation of fear and respect upon which his power was built. In the end, the decision was made not by Blade alone, but by the prison-based leadership of the 25s, with whom he had maintained connections despite his low profile during his federal incarceration. Johnson's betrayal had not just been against Blade personally, but against the code of the numbers gangs. His death would be not just revenge, but justice, according to the laws of their shadow society. The hit was carried out in April 2020. Johnson, who had been staying with a cousin in East Oakland, was shot multiple times while sitting in his car outside a convenience store. The shooters, never identified or captured, were believed to be specialists brought in from Los Angeles specifically for this job, ensuring no direct connection to Blade or his Oakland organization. The murder of Marcus Johnson immediately attracted intense law enforcement attention. Though he was no longer in witness protection, his status as a former federal witness made his killing a priority for both local police and the FBI. Investigators quickly focused on Blade as the most likely person to have ordered the hit, but proving it was another matter entirely. He had an alibi placing him at a family birthday party at the time of the shooting, and no physical or electronic evidence connected him to the crime. Nevertheless, the increased scrutiny created problems for Blade's operation. Federal agents began monitoring his movements more closely. His associates found themselves pulled over for minor traffic violations that turned into vehicle searches. Businesses connected to his network received surprise visits from regulatory agencies. Though none of this produced evidence sufficient for criminal charges, it disrupted the smooth functioning of his organization and created a pressure that hadn't existed before. It was during this period of heightened tension that another figure from Blade's past re-entered the picture, one who would ultimately play a key role in his downfall. Darius Dmac McKenzie, the former leader of the West Oakland Disciples, who had been partially paralyzed in a hit ordered by Blade years earlier, had spent his years of physical recovery building new connections and planning his return to power. Unlike Blade, who had rebuilt his organization in secret, Dmac made no attempt to hide his ambitions. From his wheelchair, he had assembled a loyal group of young soldiers eager to restore the Disciples to their former glory. His near-death experience far from dampening his appetite for the game, had only intensified it, burning away whatever restraint he might once have possessed. By mid-2020, Dmac's crew was openly challenging Blade's network, hitting drug houses, intercepting shipments, and targeting key lieutenants. The violence that Blade had so carefully minimized now returned to Oakland's streets, as two sophisticated criminal organizations engaged in increasingly bold attacks against each other. For Blade, the situation presented a difficult dilemma. Direct retaliation would likely bring even more law enforcement attention at a time when he was already under unusual scrutiny. But failing to respond would show weakness, potentially encouraging others to challenge his authority. It was precisely the kind of lose-lose scenario he had always been skilled at avoiding. In the end, Blade opted for a hybrid approach. Rather than targeting Dmac directly, he began systematically attacking the infrastructure of the Disciples' operation, corrupting their suppliers, turning their distributors, and picking off isolated soldiers in ways designed to sow confusion about who was responsible. At the same time, he reached out through intermediaries to propose a renewal of the old alliance, a division of territory that would allow both groups to profit without unnecessary bloodshed. Dmac's response was unequivocal. At a meeting arranged to discuss terms, his representatives delivered a message along with a package containing a severed hand belonging to one of Blade's couriers. The only peace comes when you're buried. With diplomacy no longer an option, the conflict escalated throughout the fall of 2020. Both sides took casualties, but Blade's operation, with its superior organization and resources, gradually gained the upper hand. By December, Dmac was increasingly isolated, his territory shrinking, his allies abandoning him as the tide turned against the Disciples. In a desperate move, Dmac reached out to local authorities, offering information about Blade's operation in exchange for immunity from prosecution for his own crimes. It was a dangerous gambit. Snitching carried a death sentence in their world. But Dmac, having already survived one attempt on his life, perhaps felt he had little to lose. What Dmac didn't know was that his contact in the Oakland Police Department was on Blade's payroll. The detective immediately informed Blade of Dmac's offer, providing detailed information about what had been discussed and what evidence Dmac claimed to have. This betrayal sealed Dmac's fate. On New Year's Eve 2020, as the city prepared to celebrate the end of a difficult year, Dmac was killed in what appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong. 3 men broke into his apartment, shot his 2 bodyguards, and executed Dmac with a single bullet to the head. Nothing was stolen, making the robbery pretense thin, but the killers left no evidence connecting them to Blade or his organization. With Dmac's death, the last significant challenge to Blade's control of Oakland's underworld was eliminated. His organization had not only survived, but emerged stronger from the conflict, having absorbed much of the Disciples' territory and personnel. Law enforcement, despite increased efforts, had been unable to build a case against him for any of the violence associated with the gang war. It seemed that Thomas Blade Mitchell had once again defied the odds, rebuilding his criminal empire while maintaining the legitimate facade that protected him from prosecution. But as has been true throughout his story, success carried within it the seeds of destruction. The specific events that led to Blade's death on February 5th, 2021, remain shrouded in conflicting accounts and rumors. What is known with certainty is that at approximately 7:30 p.m., as he sat on the porch of his home in the Maxwell Park neighborhood, A black Dodge Charger pulled up, and 3 men emerged with semi-automatic weapons. 9 shots were fired, all striking Blade, who was pronounced dead at the scene. No arrests were ever made for the murder, and the Oakland Police Department classified it as gang-related, though they declined to specify which organization they believed responsible. In the absence of official information, several theories emerged about who ordered the hit and why. Some believed it was orchestrated by remaining members of Dmac's crew, seeking revenge for their leader's death. Others pointed to rivals from outside Oakland, possibly Los Angeles or San Jose-based gangs, looking to move into territory now that both major local players had been eliminated. Still others suggested federal involvement, speculating that Blade had been operating as an informant since his early release from prison and was killed when this betrayal was discovered. Perhaps the most compelling theory, and the one accepted by many who knew the inner workings of Blade's organization, involves betrayal from within his own ranks. According to this account, Blade's second-in-command, a former 25's associate known only as Bishop, had grown impatient with Blade's cautious approach and coveted control of the lucrative operation his mentor had built. What makes this theory particularly persuasive is what happened in the weeks following Blade's death. Rather than disintegrating as might be expected after the loss of such a central figure, his organization continued to function with remarkable efficiency under Bishop's leadership. Territory was maintained, operations continued, and business relationships remained intact, all suggesting a planned transition rather than a chaotic power grab. Whatever the truth of who pulled the trigger, Thomas Blade Mitchell's death marked the end of a remarkable criminal career that had transformed Oakland's underworld. From a teenage gang member to a prison strategist to the architect of one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations the city had ever seen, Blade's life traced an arc of ambition, innovation, and ultimately, violent end that exemplifies the realities of gang life at its highest levels. His legacy is complex. Law enforcement officials acknowledge, sometimes grudgingly, the intelligence and organizational skill he brought to criminal enterprise. Community members from his old neighborhoods tell stories of his generosity, scholarships quietly funded, rent payments covered for struggling families, jobs provided to those recently released from prison. Fellow criminals speak of his fairness and reliability in a world where such qualities are rare. But no amount of admirable qualities can erase the damage caused by the drugs his organization distributed, the violence it employed when necessary, or the legitimate businesses extorted under threat of harm. Thomas Mitchell may have been exceptional in many ways, but the path he chose led inevitably to bloodshed, both others and ultimately his own. In the end, Blade's story serves as a stark reminder of the truth that has claimed countless lives in America's urban centers. In the game of power played in our streets, there are no real winners, only those who lose sooner and those who lose later. Even the most brilliant players can't change the fundamental rules. What happened to the empire Blade built? Today, 3 years after his death, Oakland's gang landscape has fragmented once again. Bishop maintained control for less than 18 months before being arrested on federal racketeering charges in August 2022. Without Blade's strategic vision or Bishop's ruthless efficiency, the organization splintered into competing factions, each claiming legitimacy, but none able to maintain the discipline that had made their operations so effective. Law enforcement officials consider this fragmentation a victory of sorts, noting that disorganized criminal groups tend to be less sophisticated in their operations and easier to prosecute. Community activists point out, however, that fragmentation often leads to increased violence as smaller crews engage in bloody competition for territory and respect. For the residents of the neighborhoods where Thomas Mitchell once walked as both predator and protector, life goes on much as it did before he rose to power. Poverty, limited opportunity, and systemic neglect continue to create conditions where young people see few paths forward. Some will choose as Mitchell did, finding in gang life a twisted version of the success, respect, and belonging that society has failed to make accessible through legitimate means. And so, the cycle continues, with new leaders rising to replace the fallen, new organizations forming from the ashes of the old, and new strategies emerging to evade law enforcement and maximize profits. The names and faces change, but the story remains tragically the same. Thomas Blade Mitchell may have changed the game in Oakland for a time, but he couldn't change its inevitable conclusion. In the end, he too became another cautionary tale in the long, sad history of American gang life. A history written in blood on city streets from coast to coast, with no final chapter in sight. If you want to understand more about how prison gangs operate across America, hit subscribe.